So today we're going to have a panel about the Marx Brothers and their Jewish connection. And the instigator of all this is Danny uh, Fingeroth. And Danny has two pals, Noah Diamond and Henry uh, Sapoznik. I believe I'm probably mispronouncing your name, Henry.
First time.
So, Danny, let me introduce who these people are a little bit. I'll introduce Danny. Danny Fingeroth has taught a number of classes for us before. His last class was about Jack Ruby. He's written a great book about Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, a lot of the stuff he did was because he was a very intense Jewish person, and a lot of his actions were he thought he was favoring us, the Jewish people, which may not be the case, but that's what he thought. And Danny also has a long history with superheroes. He taught a class to us about the superheroes like Superman and other people. And anyway, that's Danny. And Danny will introduce Noah and Henry. Wait, where's Henry? Did I introduce the wrong person here? I think.
Oh, there he is. No, Henry's still there.
Henry's still there.
Like it or not.
Wait a minute. I'm not sure. It doesn't look like Henry.
Doesn't feel like
it. Doesn't feel like Henry either. Let me put Henry in here.
Okay. Anyway,
that's Henry. You're not Henry. I'm going to remove you.
You didn't mention my most important credential with the Jewish Study Center was my participation in the Latka Hamantaschen debate.
That's true. That's true. That's where you first began. And your pal, what's his name, Zoni?
Yes, that's it.
Let me make one more comment before we begin.
Okay.
Danny came to us because someone actually recommended that Danny give a class. If any of you want to teach a class or you want a class about something, write to us at info@jewishstudycenter.org, and maybe we can have a class about that. Okay, I'm going to leave, and Danny, you can take over.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Thanks to the Jewish Study Center and everybody who signed up and showed up. This is a lot of pressure here. Looks like 200 or 300 people here. Holy cow! Everything Jerry said. Yes, and if you're in the New York area, I'm doing an event for the Jack Ruby book. The paperback just came out. I'm doing it at the Shakespeare and Company on Broadway and 70th Street on Tuesday night. So come on by, 6 o'clock. Anyway, joining me today are two guys. To call them experts is an understatement. And I'll read you their credits, but really it's just the tip of the iceberg with these guys. Noah Diamond appeared as Groucho Marx in the first ever revival of their first Broadway show, I'll Say She Is, in 2016, for which he adapted the book and lyrics. He's the author of Gimme a Thrill, 400 Years in Manhattan, Gimme a Thrill, 400 Years in Manhattan, and Love Marches On. He can be heard monthly as co-host of the Marx Brothers Council Podcast, and you can find him at noahdiamond.com. And they were foolish enough to have me as a guest on the podcast last month. So just imagine hearing this for a couple of hours. And Henry Sapoznik is an award-winning author, producer of radio and records, and performer of traditional Yiddish and American music. Let me just say, if it was not for Henry Sapoznik, there would not be a whole lot of klezmer music around identified as such. This guy really put it all together and put it on the map and plays it. And well, both these guys study stuff and then they actually perform the stuff, which is amazing. But let me finish. Henry is a 5-time Grammy-nominated performer-producer. His NPR series, the Yiddish Radio Project, won the prestigious 2002 Peabody Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. His upcoming book is The Tourist's Guide to Lost Yiddish New York City, but people from outside of New York could read it too.
Yeah, it's written in a universal language.
From Excelsior Editions. And his website is henrysapoznik.com. So welcome, gentlemen. So I'll just set the stage a little. So I'm going to be like player coach. I'll be asking questions. I'll also be commenting, and but the premise, somebody already has a question. The premise here is that, and just the subject is the Marx Brothers. When you think of Jewish comedy teams or Jewish comedy, probably one of the first images that comes to your mind is Groucho and his brothers. And yet they always claimed that there was nothing Jewish about their act. There was, that they were just they wanted to do comedy that was for everybody. And yet there's a subtext in their comedy that I think is special for Jews, almost in a way. Another one of my passions is Bob Dylan. And there's sort of a Jewish subtext to Bob Dylan that's written about a lot. And Dylan, of course, is elusive about it. So I think the Marx Brothers and Groucho were similar. So I just, today we're going to explore the level of their Jewishness, the significance of their Jewishness, both then and obviously there were a million comedy teams in the 20th century, and yet the Marx Brothers are one of the few that we actually remember. So we just want to talk about that and maybe have some fun along the way. So I'm going to, Noah put together a series of clips to sort of show what some of the rare overt Jewish content in the Marx Brothers movies. And I'm sure by the fourth or fifth time I will succeed in sharing my screen and showing it to everybody. But let's take a look at the Marx Brothers via Noah. I'm going to hit the share. All right, this will definitely work. Here we go. But what I can't see, there we go. All right.
All along here, this is the riverfront. And all along the river, those are all levees. That's the Jewish neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Are people hearing the audio here?
No audio.
Yeah.
I didn't know they made silent films.
The great thing about the Marx Brothers, just as brilliant with or without the dialogue.
Amen. Want to try it again, Danny?
You yourself are also muted, Danny, if that's useful information.
Danny, there's a on the share screen. There's a thing about include audio.
How about now? Because I see them. I'll try it again.
All along here, this is the riverfront.
Good.
All along the river, those are all levees. That's the Jewish neighborhood. Well, we'll pass over that.
Still not.
Here, and I know who it is. And they be the fish peddler from Czechoslovakia.
Ridiculous, I tell you.
Ridiculous. Wait. We prove it. He had a birthmark, remember?
Oh, please, what are you trying to say? Oh.
On the arm, on the legs, on the foot, on here, on the butt, on the whole bend. There's the birthmark.
Oh, I don't
He's the fish peddler.
I confess, I was Davy the Peddler.
Well, how did you get to be Roscoe W. Chandler?
Say, how did you get to be an Italian?
Never mind. Whose confession is it?
The Dean is furious. He's waxing Roth.
Is Roth out there, too? Tell Roth to wax the Dean for a while. Guess that's bad, huh? This is a sound football game, and I wish you were here. In fact, I wish you were here instead of me. Last week in the same hour, I told you that Mrs. Moskowitz was expecting a blessed event. But last night, Mrs. Moskowitz had twins. Okay, Mr. Moskowitz. Thank you, Professor. There's nothing at all.
Right? Okay, I'm
Well,
back.
that was almost like watching the clips. Because I think what happens, Zoom automatically
Yes.
cancels out anything that it perceives as background music. We weren't quite able to hear the musical excerpt from Animal Crackers, but of course, what's happening there is the entire company is singing "Hooray for Captain Spaulding, the African explorer," to which Groucho, as Captain Spaulding, responds, "Did someone call me Schnorrer?"
So that didn't come through and all that?
I didn't hear it. I don't know if others
Very
caught it.
low.
Wow. Okay. Well,
You know what? After this is over, everyone come to my place. We'll watch the
or we can just send the link to people. Um, okay. Anyway, but the other ones were audible?
when it was just speaking, I think it was fairly audible. But you know,
Yeah,
it's a minute or so of clips which are just the most overt Jewish references in the films, and those are few and far between. And I think part of the message here is that it's under the surface that we find the oceans of Jewishness in the brothers' work.
Noah, can you? I know you have done a lot of deep research on the brothers. What's their background? I know they were German Jews as opposed to Eastern European. Can you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, their father, Sam Marx, who was known as Frenchy because he was from Alsace-Lorraine, the region between France and Germany. Their mother and early manager was Minnie Marx, originally Minnie Schoenberg, and she was from the German village of Dornum. So yes, they were German slash Alsatian Jews whose parents came to America at the end of the 19th century. And all the Marx brothers, except Zeppo, are born in the late 19th century. Zeppo comes along in 1901. And they grew up in New York City, mostly on the Upper East Side in the neighborhood of Yorkville. By 1905, Groucho, who's the first of the brothers to enter show business, has gotten his first vaudeville gig.
And did they have much Jewish training background? I think their grandparents were observant, but
Yeah, it's a fairly typical example of each generation being a little less religious than the generation before it. The brothers themselves and their parents were they nodded in the direction of the major Jewish holidays. All five Marx brothers had bar mitzvahs, but in a sort of obligatory box checking way. Famously, Minnie purchased a speech for Chico, the eldest of the brothers, to deliver at his bar mitzvah. Chico's known as Leonard at the time, which is his given name. This was a bar mitzvah speech that began with the line, "My dear parents, for 13 long years you have toiled for my happiness." And each of the five brothers delivered that exact same speech at his bar mitzvah when it came along. So when Zeppo has the last of the Marx brothers bar mitzvahs in the year 1914, I suppose, he's also the last to deliver the same, "For 13 long years you have toiled for my happiness."
that speech is not in any archive or
Well, I guess not in its entirety, but it's well remembered in all the various memoirs written by Marx Brothers. And I think they spent their lives with a strong sense of Jewish cultural identity. With the last thing any of them would have done would be to deny being Jewish, but they were not particularly religious.
and their uncle Al Sheen, where does he fit in the picture? His name
Al
is
Sheen, yeah. Al Sheen is Minnie's brother. Abraham Schoenberg is the name he's born with. And he becomes a big star in vaudeville before the Marx Brothers are adults. During their childhood, Al Sheen is a member of a group called the Manhattan Comedy Four, which was a vaudeville a quartet of comedians. It's a kind of forerunner to the Marx Brothers. And these comedy quartets were a thing in vaudeville and a tradition that the Marx Brothers built on. Al Sheen was a Dutch comic, which means a comic who performed with a German accent, Dutch being the German word for German. And partly in that tradition, Groucho began his vaudeville career as a Dutch comic, mostly playing German.
But wasn't there sort of the line between the Dutch comic and the Hebrew comic was sort of porous, wasn't it?
A very blurry line. And during the First World War, when German references suddenly fall out of favor, Groucho has no problem dropping the quote unquote Dutch character and taking on an elderly Yiddish persona, which he did toward the end of the first period of their vaudeville career. After that, he shed the elderly school teacher character. He stopped doing Dutch or Yiddish and became the character we know from the films, which is a kind of first generation American wise guy with a painted on mustache.
Henry, what's going on in the Yiddish theater and Yiddish vaudeville in the early 20th century while the Marx Brothers are moving ahead in more mainstream venues?
What was going on by then, I mean, Yiddish theater still had its showroom shine. But at the beginning of the 20th century, Abraham Goldfaden had only invented the form in Romania in the 1880s, so that by the time Eastern European Jews came over in the 80s and 90s, they were inventing their own platform the same way that they were also being influenced by American dominant culture. So there was, in the Venn diagram of Yiddish and American and kind of what they called Hebe comedy, Yiddish-speaking Jews found that the acceptance of pure Yiddish could only be played for a general audience if it fulfilled the characterization that people were already used to. And really, as Noah just said, the Dutch comedy, the corruption of Deutsch, was already an accepted medium. There's no real template that reflects the Marx Brothers stage personas that existed in the Yiddish world. There were comedians, and I guess the closest that you could say kind of reflects back on the Marx Brothers is the use of language. The Marx Brothers making use of malaprops and of references. I don't think they drew from the Yiddish popular culture as much as, like you said, the Uncle Al and Gallagher and Sheen. There were, interestingly, their big hit, Gallagher and Sheen, their theme song, not only was a hit for them, but there were Yiddish versions. But those really were crossovers. I don't think they had a real effect on how the Marx Brothers invented their characters.
Thank you. It just seems inevitable that, given the New York centric existence of the Yiddish theater and Yiddish comedy and the Marx Brothers, somewhere somebody will find, some deeper connection that we didn't know about. I guess the question would be, why is it important to us that we're talking about the Marx Brothers being Jewish? And then why was it so important to them to claim, right? This really, talk about ambivalent. Groucho would always say, we were not specifically Jewish. We weren't aiming for a Jewish audience, but somebody thought that "Did Someone Call Me Schnorrer" was an appropriate line for a nationally distributed movie, right? I guess, and that's 3 years after The Jazz Singer. Is that just something for the New York and Chicago and LA audience that they just left in, or, and the A.B. the Fish? That was why we showed those clips. It's so interesting that they seem so Jewish and in obvious ways, at least to a Jewish audience. Why do you think they left that stuff in or put that stuff in, and yet then would deny that there was anything to it?
I think part of the answer is that in vaudeville, it was very important to appeal to the entire country. And, I mean, we talk about how polarized the country is now and everyone's in their bubble and so on, but this is truly a pre-mass media era. And Groucho himself said, one of the things about being a vaudevillian is you had to play towns where people had possibly never seen a Jewish person before. So, doing material that would only appeal to a Jewish audience would just be like commercial suicide for vaudevillians. They wouldn't do that. What they did traffic in vaudeville, and many comics trafficked in, was broadly recognizable ethnic stereotypes. So in the early Marx Brothers schoolroom act, they were all doing ethnic or national caricatures. Groucho, as we said, was playing German. Harpo enters the act playing an Irish student in the classroom routine. That's why Harpo is associated with wearing a red wig. It's kind of the last surviving vestige of his original Irish character. Chico, of course, always played Italian. And Gummo, who was the fourth brother in the act before he left the act and was replaced by the baby brother Zeppo, Gummo played what they called a Hebrew boy, a Heb character, to use the term Henry used earlier, And so there was an element of Jewish caricature in the Marx Brothers act, but it was just in the mix with all the other caricatures. A line like, "Did someone call me Schnorrer?" in a song that Kalmar and Ruby wrote for the Broadway musical Animal Crackers. I suspect that line might not have been written for one of their films originally, particularly in the later MGM period. I don't think a word like Schnorrer would have found its way into a musical number that was
Out at
written.
MGM.
Yeah, the Freed unit didn't throw around the word Schnorrer very much. I think that's a surviving vestige of Broadway. And the Broadway audience, of course, would have been very hip to Yiddish words. Even the non-Jewish Broadway audience, knew what Schnorrer meant. Yeah. And the first two Marx Brothers films, Coconuts and Animal Crackers, which are based on their second two Broadway shows, those films were made in New York, before the brothers go out to Hollywood. And I think that's why those films, those two specifically, Coconuts and Animal Crackers, seem to us more New York and more Jewish than any of their later films.
Where do they fit in with their contemporaries like Jolson and Burns and Allen?
They're much better than any of their contemporaries. They're part of that crowd. In all seriousness, they're part of that crowd. That's, in addition to being like a lot of Jews doing borderline Jewish humor, this is also the mainstream of American popular entertainment, let's say between the wars.
But well, certainly, and now I forget who had mentioned, but maybe it was it, but the attitude, the Marx Brothers, other Jewish comedian stars, maybe not Jolson, but Eddie Cantor, Danny Kaye, Jack Benny, they presented themselves in somewhat Jewish stereotypes, and certainly not as macho, powerful figures in that way. The Marx Brothers, though, had a different affect. I guess Harpo sometimes could be reticent or cute or shy, but very often all three of them portrayed this very hyper masculine kind of attitude. Not all the time. Do you think that made them different from some of the other comedians of their era?
Well, talking about, I'm sorry, didn't
No,
want to,
please.
but talking about how other Jewish comedians on the stage, like Jolson, like Cantor, part of the thing was that there was the way to make it up the ladder of success was portraying people farther down that ladder, and like Jolson and Cantor came up doing burnt cork. I mean, Jolson originally had done supposedly he was doing a Hebrew character, but burnt cork was a really powerful platform for anyone. This was really sort of like the supernova of burnt cork on major American stages. On the other hand, people like George Jessel, who did also when he was with the Kitty Review, along with Eddie Cantor, and he had been doing Jewish characters, but in Hebrew, quote unquote Hebrew dialect. I think part of the and one of the interesting things was how were they. I mean, we know how popular they were on the major American stage, but when you examine how they were perceived in the Yiddish press, it's kind of an interesting insight because even though the Marxes had already been popular by the late teens, you really don't see them celebrated in the pages of the Yiddish press. A paper, for example, like the Forward, which was really dedicated to assimilating its Yiddish-speaking readership to become Americans, even though they carried ads for coconuts and the like. The first articles about the Marxes didn't happen until like 1930. So that's a really long time for the Yiddish-speaking world to wait to celebrate these brothers who had done what everyone who came to, all the Jews who came to America, they came here to succeed. And the idea that these children, these Jewish children, became popular and dominant American society, even in the like I said, even in the Yiddish press, they were barely mentioned. So it's a kind of an interesting insight into how did the community feel a sense of ownership of these of the brothers and their success, their undeniable success. You would think, boy, they would have taken a great sense of pride in the crossover. Well, they didn't cross over. The Marxes never crossed over. They weren't first in the Yiddish theater like someone like the Paul Muni, for example. You know, he was in Yiddish theater first, and then he crossed over to Hollywood. The Marxists never did that. They completely bypassed any contact on the stage with a Yiddish-speaking audience.
So do you think the Yiddish press ignored them because they weren't Jewish enough?
No, I think that. Well, I think that to a degree, like for example, the Jessel, when he starred in the Broadway version of the Jazz Singer, got tons of press because, you know, in the original short story and in the play, he turns his back. The character Jack Robin turns his back on Broadway and goes back to the synagogue, unlike in the film, unlike in the Jolson film. So Jessel got tons of press in the Yiddish in the Yiddish world. Again, I think that this was an era in the Jewish world that anyone who was Jewish who became a success in dominant society was seen as a role model. I just think that there was so much popular Yiddish culture at the time that the Yiddish press didn't really need to dig into something that wasn't more overtly reflective of how Jews could make it in America without necessarily turning their back on their own history and their own culture.
Thanks. Noah, do we know in their vaudeville or Broadway shows for a New York audience, was there more stuff like Did Someone Call Me Schnorrer? Was there more overtly Jewish?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, you know, like any good performers, they were excellent masters at what we now call reading a room, and so they knew always what crowd they were playing to and what to do to make that crowd happy. I mean, an example of that is that Chicago had a huge burgeoning German population, especially Chicago theater goers. And so when playing Chicago, they would always bring out all the German material. Groucho would sing Schnitzelbank, and point to lead the audience because they knew who they were performing for. And that was definitely true of the Jewish audience. In fact, there's a joke from the old vaudeville tabloid from Mr. Green's Reception, an early Marx Brothers vaudeville tab, that's often quoted to illustrate how New York / Jewish humor that would bring down the house let's say in the Northeast was just an utter mystery elsewhere. And this line is the first scene of the tab is set on the docks, the Cunard docks in New York, and a boat comes in, and Groucho's character had a line, "This must be the Far Rockaway boat. I can smell the herring." Like uproarious laughter in New York, and doesn't even feel like a joke elsewhere.
Of course, if it didn't come from a Jewish actor, it would be seen as an insult. For Groucho,
yeah, possibly.
It's sort of an inside knowing wink, but not a put down that they smell like herring.
Yeah, and that's actually the other to your question, Danny, about like the sense of Jewish pride around the Marx Brothers, like they're some of our guys, I mean, like the way we take pride in Jews who made it. I mean, you even hear people talking about Jesus that way, like the Jewish version of Merry Christmas is like happy birthday to one of our guys who made it big. So the Marx Brothers, they not only did they make it big, they made it big as comedians without being losers or supplicants, without playing vulnerable. I mean, many comedians, including many great comedians and many great Jewish comedians, traded on that, on the combination of confidence and ineptitude that generates the power for most American comedy. But the Marx Brothers weren't like that. They were hyper competent. They were more like superheroes. They could accomplish the impossible seemingly with very little effort. Groucho marches into a room like he owns the place and immediately starts insulting all the people who the storyline suggests he should be supplicating to. So, it's a very flattering way to think of ourselves as the Marx Brothers, guys who don't have to follow the rules and benefit from breaking the rules.
Are you Jewish? Nobody told me. That was...
Well, yes, but I'm trying to appeal to a broad American audience.
This is not the crowd to play that to. But
I can smell the herring.
Yeah, you can. I'm a little hard of herring, so but I think part of the thing that made them really kind of superheroes is that all of their triumphs happened in a hyper Gentile world. They weren't all of the settings for them in the Grand Opera and the university and on the football field. This is the domain of the Goyim. And for these characters to come in and even if there was not an overt Jewishness and the fact that Jews understood that they were really kind of kept out of dominant society, it was the shibboleth, the idea that they weren't native speakers. And here is Groucho, who not only learned how to, speak, quickly and with verve, but he managed to use that to put something over on the dominant society and for a powerless community of people who were trying to make it up the socioeconomic ladder. This was a real, was really a powerful statement about how they can become part. They too, even if you don't have a swallowtail coat, you too can make it into dominant society.
Although there's still a context, something that just occurred to me, so it might be ridiculous, but since it was not. But you think of Groucho as Hackenbush in A Day at the Races. He's a veterinarian, and that's an era when there were Jewish quotas in medical school. So I'm thinking even Groucho, and I know the vibe is different in the MGM pictures than in the Paramount, so maybe it was to make him more sympathetic as well. But it's almost a story of a competent, medically skilled person who is forced to become a veterinarian instead of a people doctor. I mean, that's like an interesting subtext that maybe was different then in the Paramount movies. Yeah, that makes sense to me, and since I said it, I'll stand by it. Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I had uncles who became dentists. I think at least in part because they were not, and they didn't meet the quotas. There were too many Jews at the actual medical schools, and they did they did very well in dentistry. But I think their first choice would have been doctor stuff. But it's okay with me. I didn't pay a dental bill till I was 30, and how about during the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s? Um, how did that affect them on screen and off screen? I mean, Duck Soup is a very seems to be a very powerful anti-fascist statement. How did they deal with Hitler and the rise of fascism and the war?
They were very aware of what was happening in Europe, and of course, therefore, deeply disturbed by it. Harpo got the most firsthand look at it because he made history by playing Russia. In 1932, I believe, 32 or 33, Harpo does a little tour of Russia at the urging of Alexander Wolcott. And he scores big on stage, but he also, on that trip to Europe, carries out a little secret spy mission for the US government. We still don't know what documents Harpo transported on behalf of the American government, but he did. And he also witnessed some early signs of persecution of the Jews in Europe, storefronts that had Jewish stores marked and so on. I think Duck Soup, I think the anti-fascist messaging in Duck Soup is incidental. It's really more a parody of like World War I inspired films about ruritarian dictatorships than a comment on Nazism, although it did sort of uncannily start to read that way in the years that followed Duck Soup. There's also a very compelling story about Groucho in the 1950s after World War II, going on a trip back to Germany along with Alan Dwan, the producer of You Bet Your Life. They went looking for Minnie's hometown, the village of Dornum. Groucho remembered on a childhood trip there finding all these early family graves in Dornum, and none of them were anywhere to be found on this post-war return trip. Any trace of Jewish life in this village had just been completely obliterated by the Nazis. And then Groucho asked to be taken to the pile of rubble that was the former location of Hitler's bunker. Astonishingly, that location remained in a pile of rubble through like the 70s or 80s, when the Soviets reduced it to sand, essentially. So Groucho was taken to the rubble around the location of Hitler's bunker and danced on Hitler's grave, climbed up on top of this pile of rubble and did what Alan Dwan described as an enthusiastic Charleston. So Groucho Marx danced on Hitler's grave, for what that's worth.
Yeah.
And how did that, so they do Duck Soup, then they go to MGM, and then their movies, they have the Sig Ruman playing those buffoonish, very German figures. But what happens with MGM and Thalberg? I mean, why did they ever speak about why their movies did not address what was going on in the world? Where did Thalberg and MGM, they were not as Jew friendly as Paramount?
I think that's right. I mean, in general, the classic Hollywood studio era is one giant repression of ethnic identity in favor of middle American blandness. I mean, that's what's happening in the studios at the time, and MGM leads the way. I mean, there aren't really, it's not just MGM though, it's not just comedies. I mean, there are very few examples of Hollywood films that directly confront fascism or Nazism, some in subtle ways. And then later on, there are war movies, battle movies that confront it in that way, in a battleground way. But, I mean, the example that's sort of hanging in the air here is Chaplin, who 7 years after Duck Soup makes The Great Dictator, a very audacious, very direct assault on Hitler, but independently produced,
Well, don't leave out. I mean, before The Great Dictator, it was the Three Stooges who presented the first Hitler,
yeah.
You Nazi Spy. And in fact, I mean, if we're talking about Jewish brothers who like kind of strutted their Yiddishkeit, the Three Stooges would actually, well, Larry Fine would be one of the he wasn't the brother, of course, but he introduced Yiddish into a lot of the Three Stooges performances. So at a studio like Columbia, a little more poverty row than MGM, you could get away with that stuff. Cohen was not as self-hating as Louis B. Mayer, despite the fact that people said that MGM stood for Mayer's ganze Mishpuche, Mayer's whole family, because of his trait of hiring relatives. But yeah, the whole thing. I mean, this was also, remember, keep in mind that America was, at this point, it was an isolationist country. And you could, like certain radio stations, like, for example, New York's WEVD, you could lose your broadcast license if you did something which went against the American political reality at the time. It wasn't until America entered the war. I think Warner Brothers was the first film, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, with Edward G. Robinson, another Yiddle. And by then, public opinion had really changed. So I don't think MGM would have risked, I don't even know what anti-war or anti-Nazi films the MGM, that wasn't what the studio was known for, as opposed to like Warner Brothers. But so yeah, the stuff could not be in your face quite the same way.
And I'm sure I'm sure that Harry Cohn didn't want Mo to poke him in the eyes either. I think that was probably why they kowtowed to their whimsy, as
they were paying the bills. The Three Stooges were paying the bills at Columbia in a way that the Marxes were not. I mean, there's a whole parallel thing about how great comedy geniuses like Buster Keaton and Laurel and Hardy went to MGM to die, because all of the films that they made there under, at MGM were like seriously inferior to the films that they had made previously. But yeah, again, Harry Cohen is probably as nuts as Louis B. Mayer, but still gave a little more leeway to his performers.
Well, isn't Harry Cohn's funeral the origin of two classic jokes that you hear spoken about a lot of people? But one is at his funeral, somebody said, it was a big crowd, and somebody said, "You see, you give the people what they want, and they'll come out for it." And then the other wisecrack that again is attributed to many people, but where they're going around the room and try and see if people have pleasant memories, and the room is silent, and somebody gets up and finally, and he says, "His brother was worse." I think those both originated as Harry Cohn myths. Whether they really happened, I don't know. So now Groucho was a member of the Hollywood Anti-Fascist League. Was that typical of the brothers, making overt political statements like that off screen, and did that get Groucho in trouble?
I don't think it got him in trouble. And yeah, I mean, Groucho and Harpo privately were both, they were both fairly politically active. They were both old-fashioned liberal Democrats. They were vocal against fascism in their private lives, not so much in their work. Somebody, I can't think who, some associate of the Marx Brothers said, Groucho was a liberal Democrat, Harpo was a liberal Democrat, and Chico bet on the New York Yankees.
Which in those days would have made him a Republican, except for the Giants, who were Yankee fans. I don't think they crossed the river to be Dodger fans. And I'm sure we'll hear some exceptions. Was Groucho now during the Blacklist days? Though Groucho was the most visible of them with "You Bet Your Life." Even then, did he get in any? Was he the target of McCarthy or anybody like that?
Yeah, the Groucho was perceived by McCarthy and Hoover as being a Jewish leftist in Hollywood who was very likely to be a subversive character, and they kept a close eye on him. What they wound up doing was destroying the career of Jerry Fielding, who was the band leader on You Bet Your Life, who had, like so many people, some very vague, tenuous connection to someone who went to a meeting once, and Groucho said for the rest of his life that not standing up for Jerry Fielding was one of his great regrets in life. Groucho was concerned for his own career and the survival of his show, and he kind of allowed Fielding to be sacrificial lamb. And it was sort of give them Fielding and they won't go after Groucho. It was a very, like so many aspects of the McCarthy era, a dark and unfortunate moment. And Groucho, I think, lived with regret about that as much as he did about anything in a life that was not without its regrets. So there is that. Also, as Groucho got older, he got, even for him, more loose-lipped and said things, for example, about Nixon that got him in some trouble with the FBI later on. I want to mention there is some Marx Brothers royalty in the house today. Mr. Les Marsden is in our audience. Les is a performer, the only performer known for playing all three of the major Marx Brothers prominently. And Les just in the chat made a comment. One was about the large number of Jewish actors who had careers playing Nazis in Hollywood, which is a great irony. And Sig Ruman of 3 Marx Brothers movies is one example of that. Les also tells us that Susan Fleming Marx, widow of Harpo, when Les got to know her, once said that Harpo only hated 2 people in his entire life. There were only 2 people Harpo ever hated, Hitler and Lester Cowan, who produced Love Happy.
Well, welcome. Yes. So I know we're going to get to the Q&A part soon, but I have like 40 more questions, but I think I'll trim it down to 2 or 3. There's a legendary Hillcrest Country Club in Hollywood that that the Jewish comedians of that generation hung out in. My favorite thing about Hillcrest actually is that they discovered oil underneath it, which was, they literally did, and it made. I don't know how they split it up, but
we didn't have that kind of luck in Israel, did we?
Yeah, right.
So
Hillcrest.
Hillcrest. Can we talk a little about Hillcrest, Henry? Did any Yiddish actors belong to Hillcrest?
Well, I mean, that was one of the interesting things. Again, I mean, the irony, right? That Hollywood, despite the new exhibit in Hollywood about the founding of Hollywood, which had to have shoehorned in a part of the exhibit attributing the founding to Jews. So the revisionist history of Hollywood. So a number of people who ordinarily would not be that interested in belonging to a country club. Again, people like Paul Muni, who was not a golfer by any means, would ended up belonging to the country club because it made a real statement about the dignity to be part of something. I mean, was the Hillcrest Club the source of Groucho's quip about not belonging to a club that would have him as a member? I don't know. Is that
It
something?
seems to have been another club back in New York.
Oh, that was
although it varies from tellings of that anecdote.
yeah.
But yeah, that famous line, please accept my resignation. I don't want to belong to any club that will accept me for a member. And the related anecdote, which also seems to be a Long Island club, if indeed it happened, is Groucho at a restricted club being told that his daughter couldn't use being told that he couldn't use the pool. And he says, well, my daughter's only half Jewish. Can she go in up to her waist?
Well, Hillcrest, for people who don't know, was right the answer to the restricted Gentile clubs, country clubs that even in Los Angeles, even in the 30s, 40s, 50s, up until maybe the 50s, Jews were not admitted to, despite the prominence of the film business in LA. So they started their own club. But I think even in Hillcrest, there was a division I was reading between the German Jews and the East European Jews. Even there was hierarchy, but Groucho and his brothers did seem to gravitate more towards the Eastern European Jewish comedians and performers than to the German ones. I think there was that was more where they felt at home, maybe because the other comedians were mostly Eastern European. So
the Jews, I mean, just talking about that historic conflict between Western European Ashkenazim and Eastern European Ashkenazim, it's one of the reasons. Well, I don't think that the Marxes grew up with Yiddish. By the time they were born, Yiddish had ceased being a viable language in Western Europe, and for a lot of what were referred to by Yiddish-speaking Jews as Yekis, the German Jews saw kind of a condescending look at Eastern European Jews, because I mean the rise of the reform movement under Moses Mendelssohn and the idea of social assimilation, the concept of be a Jew in the home and a man in the street, was carried over in the baggage of Jews who came to the United States. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, Hollywood. I don't think there were tons of German Jews who were involved with it. That was kind of low on the social scale for German Jews to be involved with. Eastern European Jews, there was, I mean, the thing about Hollywood, of course, being invented in real time, was that because it was a new industry, it had no history of anti-Semitism built into it. That had to be imported. That had to emerge later. But I think, as you say, the fact that even though the Marxes grew up, in a German Jewish environment, still felt more of a kinship to the Eastern European Jewish kind of. They had more resonance there, because that's who made up most of the stage performers.
And what do we make of Groucho's friendship with the notoriously anti-Semitic T.S. Eliot? How did they bond?
Well, I think that friendship was important to Groucho because Groucho was an autodidactic intellectual. He, didn't make it out of high school, but he was a big thinker, and he was a very literary guy and an excellent writer and a voracious reader who was very self-conscious about his lack of formal education, and was always out to prove himself in that way. In fact, Groucho's books, although he is an excellent writer and a funny writer, his books sort of drip with this quality that you never find in his performances, which is a real eagerness to please. As a performer, Groucho's got nothing to prove. But as a writer, he was very concerned about establishing that he was an intellectual. He would have preferred to be thought of as a writer than a comic. And so being friendly with, literary heavyweights like T.S. Eliot was a real feather in his cap. It was important to him. And you can tell from their correspondence published in the Groucho letters that Eliot kind of had the same kind of feeling about Groucho, that he had achieved the status of being a sort of living legend of literature, but the mass acceptance of a popular entertainer like Groucho was something he sort of envied. I think, and others have made this observation too, that if you look at their letters, there is a little undercurrent of distrust, of sort of mutual advantage in this very high profile friendship. But in Groucho's letter to Gummo, when he describes actually meeting Eliot in person after they'd had this correspondence, Groucho goes to England and spends a little time with Eliot, and seemingly it was very awkward. I mean, they Eliot only wanted to talk about the Marx Brothers. Groucho only wanted to talk about Murder in the Cathedral, in the Wasteland. He had read up on Eliot and was trying really hard to impress him. There's no direct reference in any of this to Eliot's anti-Semitism, which is inarguable. Groucho was probably aware of it, but as far as we know, it doesn't come up anywhere in Groucho's comments about it. I do think one of those moments when there is no overt Jewish reference, but it just seems to me like a great Jewish moment is at Eliot's funeral. Groucho is invited by Eliot's wife to come and speak at the funeral. And T.S. Eliot's funeral is attended by, all these leading lights of British literature and the British theater. Groucho remembered struggling in the darkness to get up to make his remarks. And he's like sitting in Laurence Olivier's lap, because he's trying to get down this aisle. Kenneth Tynan and, all these big heavyweights are there. And when Groucho gets up to the front, he's not entirely sure what he's going to say. And he winds up just telling a joke. And the joke that Groucho tells at T.S. Eliot's funeral, which is, a man is condemned to be hanged and he's standing on the gallows on the trapdoor. And the executioner says, have you any last words before we spring the trap? And the man says, yes. He says, I don't think this damn thing is safe.
We know at the end of his life. I mean, I know we're jumping all over the place here, but we're not going to. I'll limit myself to two more questions and then go to some of the questions. So if you do have questions, even if you put them in the chat an hour ago, maybe put them in again, because there's like 100 different comments in the chat. So repeat them or come up with some new ones if you like, folks. Towards the end of his life, I mean, Groucho was never especially religious, and yet towards the end of his life, he showed up in synagogue a little bit, and then Andy Marx at the recent Marx Fest mentioned going to Hanukkah parties at Groucho's house, which is, for someone as assimilated as Groucho made out to be, to have a party that was pointedly a Hanukkah party and not a Christmas party. So what was going on with Groucho in the last few years, where he started showing up at synagogue, and of course doubling their attendance when people heard that Groucho was showing up at shul?
Some of this is about Aaron Fleming, Groucho's companion / secretary and manager in the last years of his life. The Groucho and Aaron relationship is controversial for many reasons, most of which are only kind of borderline relevant here. But part of Aaron's plan was to either marry or be adopted by Groucho. Marriage was very clear.
Had those conflicting goals. Really.
Yeah. It's one or the other. It's a coin toss for most of us, isn't it, folks? It was clear that marriage was not in the cards. Groucho was not going to get married for a fourth time, but she did campaign heavily to have him adopt her. And one of the things she did toward that was convert to Judaism, even though whatever made Groucho feel that adopting Aaron was a bad idea, I don't think the fact that she wasn't Jewish was all that important on that list. But Aaron, she had her own problems and converted to Judaism and sort of encouraged Groucho to be a more religious Jew, and toward that end, she did manage to get him to synagogue a few times. I think things like having a Hanukkah party, which Groucho's grandson Andy told us about back in May of this year, I think those things are all pretty consistent with the kinds of Jews the Marx Brothers were, proud to be Jewish, very quick to, admit isn't even the word, very quick to identify as Jewish. But as far as Judaism, as far as the religion goes, it was more like a cursory nod in the direction of the major holidays. I think they kept that up.
Well, there's also famously Andy talked about, and it's been written about, a Seder at Groucho's house, which I was, for a minute, I thought that the rabbi presiding it might have been Jack Ruby's rabbi, but I don't, because Andy, unless there were two Seders, which Andy says there wasn't, then it was not. But when he was speaking at the Marx Fest, the synagogue he mentioned was Hillel Silverman's synagogue. So, but it was a star-studded Hollywood Seder, in keeping with Aaron's ambitions, and and Groucho, and those people who Groucho knew. The one, and I need to actually go, because I think it's mentioned in this guy's memoir. But the one, you'd expect Elliot Gould and George Siegel and Harry Ruby to be at Groucho's Seder. Ron Wood of the Rolling Stones showing up at Groucho's Seder is one that I can't quite figure out. So that maybe somebody out there knows something more about.
He thought they were the Rolling Steins. That could have really been.
I think they performed with the Rolling Steins.
Oh, okay, good.
At one point.
When they crossed over.
Now I know why I assembled this crew. This whole conversation. And by the way, you guys should have been at the pre-conversation we had yesterday. That would have been a great part two, and I regret not surreptitiously recording it. And then just sort of a general, the Marx Brothers, you can almost draw a line from the Marx Brothers to Mad Magazine, to Lenny Bruce, to Seinfeld, to Mel Brooks. A lot of them were much more open and assertive about their Jewishness. Do you think the Marx Brothers opened the door a little bit with that Someone Called Me Schnorrer and Down by the Levees, and that these other people were able to open further? What do you think their influence was on later expressions of Jewishness in show business?
I would say probably their specific influence that way was probably incidental, but I think they were hugely influential on comedians, on basically all comedy after the Marx Brothers. Whether an individual comedy artist is aware of it or not, the Marx Brothers are just in the water supply, and you sort of can't not be influenced by them. I think the next generation of Jewish comedians to come along, your Woody Allen, Mel Brooks generation, they confront their Jewishness much more candidly. But I think that has more to do with the times that they were living in than with their own sensibilities. If the Marx Brothers had come along a generation later, they would have been part of that stand-up comedy generation where it was much more inward looking, getting humor out of who you are and telling some embroidered version of your own story. There's nobody, the Marx Brothers don't have any contemporaries who present as more overtly Jewish than they do. And this is one of those things that applies to Groucho a little more than the others, strictly because Harpo didn't talk and Chico did an Italian accent.
What kind of anti-Semitism, David Goldstein asks, what kind of anti-Semitism did the Marx Brothers face as performers?
I don't know a lot of specific stories, but Groucho in his memoir, it says generally that out in vaudeville, touring the country, you just encountered a lot of anti-Semitism. Actors are also second-class citizens in that version of America. So being both actors on the road and Jews made them, pretty much unwelcome everywhere they went. And they felt that acutely. But I can't think of a lot of anecdotes about anti-Semitic incidents. Harpo has a story in his memoir, Harpo Speaks, about as a very young man getting a gig playing the piano in a brothel in Long Island and being sort of the subject of nasty anti-Semitic remarks from the madam at this brothel.
And who hasn't played piano in a brothel on Long Island?
And if you and who doesn't expect a few anti-Semitic remarks while doing so?
There's a question. For the next question, I think a lot of the prejudice that they encountered because they were actors from New York, that always reads to me as sort of code for Jews.
Absolutely.
And maybe even in the real incidents it was, but I think in their telling it, they maybe sanitized it to actors. Henry, do you think maybe some of the Yiddish actors and Yiddish performers were wary of that kind of thing, and maybe that's that might be the difference between them and the Marx Brothers, that the Yiddish actors and performers stayed in that circuit. Do you think that may be part of why some of them didn't cross over?
Well, crossing over was kind of, that was the goal of really everyone. Everyone tried to cross over. Again, Paul Muni succeeded pretty early, and for someone, in his case anyway, for someone for whom English was a second language, that was a really pretty amazing accomplishment, as opposed to someone like Molly Picon, who always tried to cross over. She made some Vitaphone shorts in the 20s, and periodically would appear. Well, later she was in Fiddler on the Roof, but they never succeeded, even though she was a native English speaker. Could not cross over. But you went out to Hollywood in order to cross over. Few people went out. The only people who went out to Hollywood who spoke more Yiddish than they did in New York were like James Cagney. He has more Yiddish in his films than any 5 Yiddish actors of the same time, and he was doing it because he could get away with it. The stories about his, introducing Yiddish. But I think a lot of people who were in the Yiddish circuit really, they wanted to be there. And the idea of crossing over was kind of breaking a compact with the community. The only reason that someone like Maury Schwartz ends up in some B movies in the early 50s, Slaves of Babylon, that he made for Columbia, was he was trying to keep his Yiddish theater afloat, and there was a better paycheck working in Hollywood than being on the Yiddish stage. So I don't think a lot of these performers really saw it. They would have liked to have done both, but I think even as the Yiddish stage only had like maybe a decade, maybe at the most 2 in the United States, that it was really on top before it started. Before immigration from Eastern Europe was cut back, and the audience. And the language began to disappear as a viable medium for performers.
Interesting. Elizabeth Graham asked, I remember reading something about Harpo trying to work toward helping some cousins get out of Germany during World War II. Is that correct? And do you know anything about that?
Yeah, that's true. I don't have a lot offhand to add to that, but yes, there is a story like that. And yeah, I'm sorry I don't have it pluckable from my brain right now, but yes, that is true.
And Les Marsden and some other people are talking about Harpo's harps going to Israel, or how did that?
Yeah, that's right. Susan Marx, Harpo's widow, donated one of his harps to, I think it's at the Jerusalem Academy of Music. It's still there. In fact, Seth Sheldon, who I don't think was able to join us today, but Seth is a great Marx Brothers and Harpo scholar who played the role of Harpo in the revival of I'll Say She Is and other places. Seth was there just recently in the last couple of months at the Jerusalem Academy of Music and went there to try to lay eyes on Harpo's harp. It was at the moment he happened to be there, it was on loan to another institution, so he wasn't able to see it. But it's there. It's being used by students who are learning on it. Andy Marx, mentioned earlier, Groucho's grandson, also visited the harp. On that occasion, it was there. And in the Marx Brothers Council group on Facebook, you can find some photographs that Andy posted a couple of years ago, posing with his uncle Harpo's, his great uncle Harpo's harp.
Well, is that the one with the barbed wire? Is that the same?
No, that's the one that Salvador Dali made for him.
That's the
Now, Salvador Dali, who, like many of the surrealists, took a real fancy to the Marx Brothers and at one point wrote a treatment for an unproduced Marx Brothers film. He visited Harpo in Hollywood in 1937 and presented him with a gift, which was a harp with barbed wire strings. And he left this thing with Harpo, and Susan just threw it away one day. So it just doesn't exist anymore. Boy, if the harp that Salvador Dali made for Harpo still existed, there's not a museum on earth that wouldn't love to get their hands on it. And most of when we hear that story, that's what we regret. Oh, I can't believe she just threw it away. But I like to think about the garbage men. They must have been some Palm Springs trash collectors who found this thing waiting outside the Marx home one day. I don't think, and they didn't think, hey, that looks like a Salvador Dali harp.
No, they probably thought, oh crap, barbed wire we got to deal with now.
Yeah, these entertainers. What are these Jews throwing out now?
Charles asks, are you aware of any links between the Marx Brothers and more overtly Jewish vaudevillians like Harry Steppe or the Howard brothers, Willie and Eugene?
Probably appeared on a bill together now and then, the odds are, but no, I don't know of any specific anecdotes or connections. There are some anecdotes about the Marx Brothers and Fanny Brice. Fanny Brice is an interesting character in this mix. Mainstream entertainer, star of vaudeville, Broadway, radio, right up there with the Marx Brothers, and who at least some of the time was considerably more overtly Jewish than they were. I think you could talk about.
Yeah, she did a ton of dialect stuff. Mrs. Cohen at the Beach was a big hit for her when she did. That was before she switched over to doing the child act.
Baby Snooks.
Baby Snooks. But I mean, that was kind of she kind of represented the kind of supernova. The year that she started on the Ziegfeld Follies, she was on the same stage with Burt Williams, the African American comedian, who was still doing his act in blackface. So I mean, she was doing a Jew act, and Burt Williams was doing a burnt cork, a dialect act. But I don't think the Marxes ever engaged in such a deeply textured Jew act as the stuff that she did, or at least not after they became the Marx Brothers with capital T.
There's an interesting connection between them, again, jumping back and forth in time here, between the Marx Brothers. When boxing was a Jewish sport, the Marx Brothers had a connection to Benny Leonard.
Yeah.
And he was involved with one of their shows. Was he dating somebody that was in the show or something? What was the deal?
All of the above. Yeah. Benny Leonard was a major financial backer of On the Mezzanine, which was the last of the major Marx Brothers vaudeville tabs prior to their Broadway breakthrough in I'll Say She Is. On the Mezzanine, which is also later called On the Balcony, is also the debut of the Marx Brothers what we'll call their 20th century characters. Groucho as the painted on mustache, the New York character, rather than the German or Yiddish character. So Benny Leonard was a backer of this act. He was also romantically involved with Herman Timberg's sister. Herman Timberg, who was a great vaudeville star in his own right, another one of these Jewish stars who had mainstream success playing a kind of barely coded Jewish character in the same way that a lot like Eddie Cantor in many ways. He also is a member of the Timberg family, and Sammy Timberg, the composer, wrote the music for many Fleischer cartoons and so on. So Herman Timberg's sister, Hattie Darling, was the ingenue of this tabloid on the mezzanine, and Benny Leonard was both dating her and financing the act. Eventually, the brothers bought this piece of material from Timberg and took it in another direction. And at that point, Hattie Darling / Timberg was no longer in the act, and neither was Benny Leonard. But while he was, there was a comedy boxing routine in it in which the Marx Brothers boxed with Benny Leonard. And boy, would we like to see that if we could.
Wow, who's got that footage?
Nobody at all.
And then here's one of there is a legend that Jack Benny met his future wife, Mary Livingston, at a Seder at the Marx Brothers house. Is there any truth to that, Bubba Misa?
Just a little. Some versions of the story, it's a Seder. In more versions of the story, it's just a family dinner. And it's not at the Marx family house. It's at a Marx family house, but it's a different Marx family. Mary Livingstone, Jack Benny's wife and co-star, was born Sadie Marx, but it's Marx, Marks, and she's not related to the Marx Brothers. Her family in Vancouver was known for hosting these big dinners for showbiz people. And on one occasion when they were playing Vancouver, Zeppo Marx attended one of these dinners along with his friend Benjamin Kubelski from Waukegan, Illinois, who grows up to be Jack Benny. And it was at that party that Jack meets Mary. So Zeppo was there. It was a Marx family dinner. But somehow in the retelling over the years, a common incorrect version of this story is that Jack and Mary met at a Seder at the Marx Brothers family home in Chicago during the years that they were living in Chicago. It's not quite right.
And was Ron Wood there?
Yeah, they forgot to rub the lamb's blood on the door to keep Ron Wood away.
And a couple of, let's see, somebody wants to know what happened to Gummo, and I guess the corollary would be what happened to Zeppo, especially since there is a new Zeppo book about to come out. But what happened to Gummo and Zeppo?
Gummo was with the Marx Brothers Act almost from the beginning. He's the second brother after Groucho to enter show business. And during their ascent in vaudeville, the four Marx Brothers were Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Gummo. Gummo was a good dancer. He did have something to contribute to the act, but he didn't like it very much. He just wasn't interested in being a performer. And when the First World War comes along, and it's pretty hard to have a family with 5 brothers and none of them are in the service. So Minnie sort of said to Gummo, "You're the most expendable member of the act, so join the army." The war was almost over by the time Gummo enlisted. He never saw action or even left the country. He served admirably in Illinois. But after the war was over, he didn't want to go back into the act, and he did a number of other things. He was in the garment business for a while, which is kind of the other option besides show business for Jews at the time. And then later he becomes an agent along with Zeppo. Zeppo, the baby boy of the family. Yes, it's true. In 2 days, on the 15th, Robert Bader's long-awaited biography of Zeppo Marx, which is called Zeppo, the Reluctant Marx Brother, will be available. And apparently, we're all going to learn a lot more about Zeppo than we ever expected to know, including his ties to organized crime, the many industries he worked in during and after his show business career. The role of the fourth Marx brother is kind of, by definition, expendable. There's no question about it. Groucho, Harpo, and Chico are the heart and soul of the act. It is also true that they were never as good as a trio as they were as a quartet. And there's something about the energy of the four Marx brothers in those first five movies that is, to my eye, and I think to many viewers, just inarguably better. I think Zeppo having this kind of nothing role, in a way, it contributes to the atmosphere of absurdity that makes those movies so winning. It also makes clear that there's nothing more important than being a Marx brother. I mean, there's no status that could mean more, because here's a guy, Zeppo, who doesn't seem to have much else going for him. He's not really a great comedian. He can sing a little, he can dance a little, but the main reason he's here is because he is a Marx brother. And on that basis, he is, one of the four greatest guys in the world in this movie.
And yet,
Isn't it also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
he went on to invent like a prototypical artificial heart, right? I mean, that
A heart monitor, yeah, a wristwatch that would monitor your heart and warn of irregularities and possible imminent heart attacks. Yeah, he was an inventor. He held many patents. He had a role in the invention of the Marmon clamp, which is what held the atom bomb to the airplane. He was a citrus farmer. He was a commercial fisherman. Like Chico, he was a gambler and had many connections with the underworld in New York and Hollywood. It was popularly said that offstage, Zeppo was the funniest Marx brother, because that would be a surprising thing to hear about him if you've seen any of their movies, where he seems to be the least funny. But I think after we've all read Robert Bader's book, we will understand that Zeppo being the funniest Marx brother is one of the least remarkable things about him.
and of course, then his ex-wife went on to be Barbara Sinatra, which is just like a weird.
Yes, indeed.
Connect the dots. Henry, I'm sorry, I interrupted something you were going to say.
No, I was just going to underscore that his role was a critical one. I mean, vaudeville was built on the strength of straight men. That any good comedy act needed a good straight man, and they were like a kind of a descriptor that you needed a kind of quote unquote bland background in order to have the comedy play off it. That's one of the reasons straight men got top billing in vaudeville, and they also got 60. It was always a 60-40 split between the straight man and the comic. So I think that was a vestigial, in a way, it was a vestigial role that he was playing, that you needed to have someone who was to play off of, as opposed to all of them being like the Ritz brothers. There was no such thing as a straight man. They were all frenetic and frantic. And then of course, once at MGM, once the Marx Brothers films needed a romantic subtext, they were able to introduce him, but that was only because it was an accepted platform for a performer to take.
That's certainly true about the importance of straight men. Unfortunately, Zeppo only occasionally in those five Paramount films are there really examples of Zeppo doing the work of a great straight man. I mean, there's the great letter dictation scene in Animal Crackers, hunga dunga, hunga dunga, hunga dunga, and McCormick. And Zeppo definitely plays straight man to Groucho for many consecutive minutes in that scene, and shows that he did have the ability to kind of play ball with his big brothers. And he does a beautiful job there. There are a couple of moments in Duck Soup also where he plays straight man to Groucho effectively. And a couple of moments in Monkey Business and Horse Feathers where he is an adequate romantic leading man. But, more often in the films of the Marx Brothers, Groucho and Chico are straight men to each other. Supporting characters like the characters Margaret Dumont played were important straight men to all the brothers. In the stage versions of Coconuts and Animal Crackers, as well as I'll Say She Is, Zeppo had a slightly bigger role, and maybe if we could have seen those on stage, we would be able to make a stronger argument for Zeppo as a straight man. But it's funny. He's obviously the least of the Marx Brothers, but it feels like a stretch to put him in a class with George Burns and Bud Abbott and the great straight man of comedy. He's not quite enough of anything.
But he's in some ways essential in a way that Alan Jones and Alan Alda couldn't read. I mean, I guess they were real actors and sing. Well, so it was a different vibe, a different feeling than the audience knowing. Well, these are the four brothers, right? They're not. We didn't even get into the Haggadahs that show the four brothers as the Marx Brothers.
Oh yeah, Dick Coder, the cartoonist Dick Coder, has a famous illustration depicting the Marx Brothers as the four sons in the Haggadah. Groucho as the wise son, Harpo as the son who doesn't even know what to say.
Chico as the wicked son.
Yeah, it only goes so far, but then the story of the four sons only goes so far.
So and there's, in general, it's interesting. We're in a period when there's, I guess, through the internet, there's just and archives expanding. There's all these books coming out. There's two Margaret Dumont biographies. Have both come out yet, or just one of them?
One has come out. The really anticipated one, we don't have a date for yet, but it's in the works. It's written by Jane Margaret Late and Reginald Pitts. Right. They gave a presentation at Marx Fest earlier this year, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. This seemingly will also be a book full of revelations, and there's a lot about Margaret Dumont that isn't widely known, but is really very interesting.
The only brother, there's no Gummo in the works, right?
Well, Gummo's son Robert wrote a memoir called "Son of a Gummo." Okay. That was, I think, privately published, or all but privately published. Very hard to find, but it's out there someplace.
Well, someone's just entered the waiting room. They really they're just in time for us to say it's we've gone over time, and this has been great. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Henry. Thank you to everybody in the audience for the questions and comments. I'm saving the chat so that I can read them later, and so if you've made any personal attacks on me, I'll refute them right now and say they're not true, but otherwise I look forward to reading them. Jerry, thank you so much, and back to you in the newsroom, Jerry. I can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, one of my many errors. Okay, thank you all, not only Danny, but also Noah and Henry. It was great. I mean, I learned things. Who would have thought Harpo was a spy? I mean, that's weird. Like that guy, the baseball player Berg was a spy. Who knows about all these things? And by the way, you mentioned the chat, Danny. The chat is so great. I'm going to include that when after I post the recording, I'll send an email to everyone with the link to the recording. But I'll also include the chat, because the chat is wonderful. And I'll also post the chat on our website. I mean, it wasn't as good as your conversation. I won't say that, but it was very good.
Well, thanks everybody for doing that.
You had a little competition there with the chat. I have one question. Mindy actually asked, but I think it's a good question. Within the Marx Brothers family, was Groucho sort of the leader? What was the relationship among the members of the family? Did Groucho sort of help you what to do? How did that work?
I think there was a real division of that kind of authority in the Marx family. In some ways, Groucho had this role as the leader. He was the member of the family who had the most status. He was the one you had to get involved in a project, for example, to make it fly. But I think Gummo, maybe more than any of them, was kind of a leader. Gummo sort of, in a way, inherited Minnie's role as their manager and, in a way, their mother. I mean, Gummo was the one who,
Well, that's a quote from Minnie that Gummo is my mother, right?
yeah, right. And so Gummo, was the one who would like plan family gatherings, when there was a family funeral, Gummo was the one who had to attend to that, notify people, and make everything flow. I think Gummo as the one of the brothers who was not a celebrity, who was barely known because he got out of show business before anyone shot a frame of footage of them. Gummo could operate anonymously in a way that the others couldn't, and I think he took care of the rest of them in a big way. Late in life, when interviewers would ask Groucho, "Which of your brothers were you the closest to?" and then brace themselves for a sea of Harpo and Chico anecdotes, and Groucho would always say, "Gummo, I'm the closest with Gummo." And
But didn't Chico do a lot of the handling in at least a part of the time at card games and so on?
yeah, from the 20s through the early 40s, Chico was an important mover of the brothers as a business entity, partly because, yeah, he played cards with a lot of powerful Hollywood people. But by the time their major film career is over, Chico is the one who needs handling.
Right.
Okay, very good. I mean, you mentioned Molly Pecan. As Danny knows, my parents had a resort hotel in the Catskills, and every summer, for one time, we would have Molly Pecan. She was the big star. Most of the people in the who are our guests were almost all were Jewish and Yiddish speaking. So she was the big attraction. So it was very nice hearing all you guys talk about people some of whom I've heard. I mean, I used to listen to Fanny Bryce, Baby Snooks when I was a little kid and stuff. So it was really nice. And thank you all again. We don't have any more classes scheduled at the moment. I am in discussion with a class. Some of you in the audience, or maybe you guys saw the movie Oppenheimer, where they talk about Oppenheimer's history and making of the bomb, and then later Oppenheimer lost his security clearance because Strauss, Strauss, who was the AEC chair, brought charges against him. Well, there's this guy in Los Alamos, where the bomb was actually developed, who is a rabbi and a top physicist. He's a member of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's going to give a class about Oppenheimer versus Strauss and the Jewish connection, why they're opposed to each other Jewishly. Interesting. And we'll have other classes also later on that people will get our email and you'll see that. Again, it's the third time I'm thanking you, but I think it was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And the email will come out with the chat and also the link to the conversation among the three of them. Okay.
Thank you. Happy
Shana Tova, everyone.
Thank you. I hope that Oppenheimer event will cover Zeppo Marx and the Marmon clamp.
That's a good question. I'll ask him about that.
Involved.
I'll ask the physicist rabbi about that. That's a good question.
Nick Meyer, who's got a new Sherlock Holmes novel out and was the writer or director of the Star Trek movies and the 7% Solution. I did an interview with him earlier in the year, but he's got a story about not a Seder, but a Thanksgiving dinner at Oppenheimer's house, where as a child he was like 6 years old, sitting next to Albert Einstein. And I won't ruin Nick Meyer's story. You should get him on. You should get Henry on. You should get Noah on. These would be great shows, and maybe they could even do the Hamantash and Latka debate.
Maybe so. Yeah, we also had a class about a year ago by this fellow whose family was allowed into the country because they published Einstein's papers, So there's some connections. Okay.
Thank you, Ron,
Thank you for the fourth time.
Hey, take care, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.